Chapter 5. They Know US Now. Part 1. They started to change. At first, nothing looked different. The reports came in the same way they always did, fragmented across systems, tactical summaries layered over raw data, coalition alerts mixed with human analysis. Everything following the same structure they had relied on since the war began. And yet beneath that familiar surface something had already shifted in a way that couldn't be measured immediately. Something subtle enough to pass unnoticed if you weren't looking for it, but impossible to ignore once you saw it. Because the Vark weren't just adapting anymore. They were choosing. The first indication didn't come from a major battle or a large-scale engagement. It came from a minor encounter at the edge of contested space. A routine patrol intercepting what should have been a standard Vark scouting cluster. Something predictable, something manageable, something that had been encountered dozens of times before, but this time the interaction didn't follow the expected pattern. They disengaged, the report said. Jake read it twice. Not because he didn't understand it, because it didn't fit. They had the advantage, he said quietly, the thought forming as he spoke, continuous, uninterrupted, already connecting to everything that came before. They should have pressed. Bennett nodded slightly, her focus on the deeper layers of the data. They chose not to. And that word carried weight now. Chose. Because until recently, Vark behavior had always been explainable through optimization, through efficiency, through outcome-based decision systems that removed unnecessary risk and maximized success. But this wasn't optimal. This was selective. Lyra remained silent for a moment, not because she had nothing to say, but because something in the data felt familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place, something that aligned not with the system they had seen on the station, but with what she had felt inside it. They're testing boundaries, she said finally, her voice quieter now, more grounded after what she had gone through, but still carrying that edge of something deeper. Jake looked at her. What kind of boundaries? She didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't simple. Behavioral, she said, her thoughts flowing steadily, connecting without hesitation, not just what works, what's possible. And that was different, because possibility isn't just about survival. It's about exploration. The next report came hours later. Then another. Then more. And the pattern started to form. Vark units disengaging from winning engagements. Others holding position longer than necessary. Some reacting slower than expected. Others, faster in ways that didn't match previous models. They're inconsistent, Cross said. But Jake shook his head slightly. No, they're variable. And that distinction mattered. Because inconsistency suggests error. Variation suggests intent. Bennett brought up a comparative model, aligning recent encounters with historical data, and the divergence was clear now. Not random, not chaotic, but structured in a way that didn't collapse under analysis. They're expanding behavioral range, she said. Jake exhaled slowly. Like we do. And that was the moment the realization deepened. Because until now, the Vark had always been efficient. Now, they were becoming flexible. Lyra's voice came lower. It's not just the entity anymore. Jake turned. What do you mean? She held his gaze. The change isn't centralized. And that was worse. Because it meant the system had already distributed what it learned. Not just control. Behavior. They don't need it to act like it anymore, she said. They've integrated it. Silence followed. Because that meant something irreversible had already happened. The war shifted again after that. Not in scale. In nature. Engagements became harder to predict. Not because the Vark were faster, but because they weren't always doing what they should, sometimes pulling back when they had advantage, sometimes pressing when they shouldn't, sometimes holding position in ways that didn't match any strategic model. They're reading us differently, Bennett said. Jake nodded. They're thinking about us. And that was the line. The one they had been approaching since the beginning. Because reacting to behavior is one thing. Understanding it is another. Lyra looked at the data again. But now it didn't feel like enemy movement anymore. It felt like something else, something closer to interaction, like the Vark weren't just engaging in combat, they were engaging in interpretation. They're not just learning how we fight, she said. Jake finished it. They're learning why. And that changed everything. Because once an enemy understands why you act, it can predict what you will do before you do it. The next engagement confirmed it. A human fleet entered a contested zone expecting resistance on approach, a standard compression maneuver based on previous encounters. But instead of reacting to the formation, The Vark repositioned before the maneuver even completed, not countering the movement, but anticipating its purpose, shifting space in a way that forced the humans into a disadvantage before the engagement even began. They moved before we committed, a pilot reported. Jake's voice dropped. They knew the intent. Lyra didn't look away from the stream. They felt it. And that was worse. Because feeling implies something beyond logic. Something closer to alignment. The war wasn't just tactical anymore. It was psychological. Every movement carried meaning. Every decision revealed intention. And the Vark were reading it. Jake stepped back slightly, his expression more focused than ever. They know us now, he said. And that wasn't fear. It was recognition. Because this wasn't the same enemy they had been fighting before. This was something that had crossed a threshold. Something that didn't just react, didn't just adapt, but understood. And once something understands you, it doesn't just fight you better. It fights you differently. Lyra's voice came softer now, and we helped them get there. Silence settled again, because that part couldn't be denied anymore. Everything they had done, everything they had tried, every attempt to understand, to adapt, to connect, had accelerated the process. Jake looked at the data one last time, then forward, toward what was coming next. Then we change, he said, not as a plan, as a necessity, because the war they had been fighting was already over, and the one replacing it had just begun. Part 2, they're trying something else. At first, no one recognized it for what it was, because nothing about it looked like communication in the way they understood it. There were no signals in the traditional sense, no structured transmissions, no direct attempts to establish contact, just behavior that didn't fit, patterns that didn't resolve into strategy, movements that seemed inefficient, even pointless, and yet they kept repeating. The first instance was dismissed as error. A Vark cluster entered engagement range, positioned itself in a stable formation, and then did nothing. It didn't attack, didn't retreat, didn't adjust to incoming pressure. It simply held position, maintaining a fixed distance while human ships waited for a response that never came. They're stalling, one pilot reported. Jake didn't answer immediately, because something about the positioning felt deliberate in a way that didn't match hesitation or miscalculation. No, he said slowly, the thought forming as he observed the spacing, the angles, the alignment between units. They're maintaining structure. Bennett pulled up a full spatial map, overlaying previous Vark formations against this one, and the difference became clear almost instantly. This wasn't random positioning. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't even tactical in a recognizable sense. It's symmetrical, she said, and that word changed everything. Because symmetry serves no purpose in combat, but it does in something else. Lyra leaned slightly forward, her eyes tracking the formation not as a battlefield but as a pattern, something her mind now processed differently after everything she had experienced, something that felt less like movement and more like arrangement. It's repeating, she said quietly. Jake turned. Repeating what? She didn't answer right away, because the answer wasn't immediate. It wasn't a direct translation. It was something that had to be recognized rather than decoded. Not movement, relationship, she said. And that was the key. Because what the Vark were doing wasn't about where they were. It was about how they were positioned relative to each other. The fleet held fire, not by hesitation but by instinct, because something about the situation felt wrong to interrupt, not dangerous in the usual sense, but significant in a way that wasn't understood yet. They're waiting for something, Cross said. Jake nodded slightly. Or someone. Lyra's breathing shifted again, not unstable, but deeper, like she was aligning with something she didn't fully control, her perception extending beyond the visible again, but this time without the same intensity as before, more controlled, more distant. They're not targeting us, she said. They're presenting something. Bennett's voice tightened. Presenting what? Lyra's eyes moved across the formation again, tracing the lines, the angles, the spacing, and then it happened. Not fully, not perfectly, but enough for recognition to begin forming. It's a pattern we've used before, she said. Jake felt that immediately. Where? She didn't look at him. In the system. Silence. Because that meant this wasn't new. This was something learned. Something taken. Something being used. The Vark formation shifted slightly, not breaking, not attacking, just adjusting, refining the structure, like correcting alignment, like repeating an attempt at something that hadn't been understood yet. They're iterating, Bennett said. Jake's voice dropped, like they're trying to get it right. Lyra nodded slowly. They don't know if we'll recognize it. And that changed the situation completely. Because now this wasn't just behavior. It was intention. The next adjustment in the formation was more obvious, not in complexity, but in clarity, the symmetry tightening, the spacing aligning in a way that reduced ambiguity, like simplifying a message. It's becoming more readable, Bennett said. Jake looked at Lyra. Can you understand it? She hesitated. And that hesitation was important, because it meant she wasn't being pulled into it. She was interpreting it. Not directly, she said, her voice steady but careful. But it's not random. It's structured around relational meaning, not symbolic, more like alignment of states. Jake exhaled slowly. They're not sending data. Lyra finished it. They're showing it. And that was something entirely different. Because showing doesn't require shared language. It requires shared perception. The formation held again. Waiting. The silence stretched. And then something changed. A single VARC unit broke formation. Not aggressively. Not unpredictably. But deliberately. It moved closer. Slow. Controlled. Not toward the fleet as a whole. Toward one specific ship. Jake saw it immediately. Which one? Bennett answered. It's selecting a target. But Lyra shook her head. No. Her voice was softer now. It's selecting a reference. And that word mattered. Because reference implies comparison. Connection. Meaning. The unit stopped at a precise distance. And held. Jake's voice lowered. Do we engage? No one answered immediately. Because something about this moment felt like a threshold. Not tactical. Something else. Lyra stepped slightly forward. Not physically, but in attention. Her focus locking onto that single unit in a way that was different from before. More controlled. Less invasive, but still connected. It's not attacking, she said. It's waiting for response. Jake looked at her. What kind of response? She didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't coming from logic. It was coming from something else. Recognition, she said. Silence. Because that meant the next move was theirs. Jake exhaled slowly, then made the call. Hold fire. The fleet stayed still. No movement. No aggression. No disruption. And for a moment, nothing happened. Then the VARC unit moved again. Slightly. Adjusting position. Refining alignment. And the larger formation behind it shifted in response. Not reacting. Adapting. They're reacting to our stillness, Bennett said. Jake nodded. They're testing behavior. Lyra's voice came softer now. They're trying to understand us the same way we try to understand them. And that was the moment the war changed again. Because this wasn't just combat anymore. This was interaction. Not friendly. Not safe. But intentional. The unit held its position. The formation remained intact. And the silence between both sides was no longer empty. It was filled with something else. Something new. Something neither side fully understood yet. But both were now participating in. Jake looked at the scene in front of him, then at Lyra, then back again. They're trying to talk, he said. Lyra didn't look away. Yes. And that single word carried more weight than any battle. Because communication changes everything. It creates possibility. It creates risk. It creates connection. And connection had already nearly destroyed them once. Part 3. We answered. At first, no one moved because the weight of the decision wasn't tactical. It wasn't about winning or losing the engagement. It wasn't about positioning or advantage. It was about crossing a line that once crossed couldn't be undone. Because responding meant acknowledging that what was happening wasn't just behavior anymore. It was intention, and intention demands response. Jake didn't rush the decision, not because he didn't understand the urgency, but because he understood something else, something deeper, that whatever they did next would define the direction of everything that followed. Not just this encounter, but the war itself. They're waiting, Bennett said, her voice controlled but tight, because she could see the pattern holding, stable, unchanged, persistent in a way that didn't align with anything they had seen before. Jake nodded slowly. I know. Lyra didn't look away from the VARC unit in front of them, her focus steady, grounded, but still carrying that underlying connection, that subtle awareness that hadn't fully left her since the station. They won't repeat it forever, she said, her voice low but continuous. They're adjusting with every second we don't respond, refining expectation, narrowing interpretation. Jake exhaled slowly. Then we respond before they decide for us. And that was the moment. The shift. Not reaction. Choice. The fleet remained still, holding formation, no aggressive movement, no visible escalation, just presence, controlled and deliberate. And for a brief moment nothing changed. The Vark unit remained in place, the larger formation behind it holding its structure like a frozen pattern waiting to be completed. Now what? Cross asked quietly. Jake didn't answer immediately, because the question wasn't simple. There was no protocol for this. No historical model for responding to something that wasn't quite communication but wasn't quite combat either. Lyra spoke first. Not movement, she said, her thoughts flowing without interruption, connecting naturally. Movement is what they expect. Movement is what they're already modeling. If we respond with action, they'll interpret it as intent to engage. Jake looked at her. Then what do we give them? She didn't hesitate. Alignment. That word settled into the room. Strange. Unfamiliar. But somehow, right. Bennett turned toward the control interface. You want to mirror the structure. Lyra shook her head slightly. Not mirror, correspond. Jake understood the difference immediately. Not identical. Compatible. And that was the key. Because identical can be ignored. But compatibility creates connection. The fleet adjusted slowly, not breaking formation, not advancing, just shifting positions in subtle ways, adjusting spacing, angles, relative alignment between ships, not randomly, not tactically, but relationally, matching the structure of the Vark pattern without copying it directly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but intentional. The moment it happened, the Vark formation reacted. Not aggressively, not defensively, but instantly. They saw it, Bennett said. Jake didn't respond, because he was watching the change. The Vark unit in front moved slightly, refining its position again, adjusting to the new alignment, and behind it the larger formation shifted in synchronization, not to counter, not to attack, but to match. They're responding to the relationship, Lyra said. And that was the moment the interaction became real. Not battle, not standoff. Exchange. The fleet adjusted again. Slow. Measured. Each movement carefully chosen to maintain coherence without escalating. The Vark followed. Not perfectly, but clearly. They're learning the structure, Bennett said. Jake shook his head slightly. No, they're confirming it. Because this wasn't random iteration anymore. This was validation. The space between the two sides became something new, not empty, not hostile, but active in a way that didn't rely on force, like an invisible framework forming between them, something both sides were building without fully understanding. Lyra's breathing shifted again, not unstable, but deeper, more connected, her perception stretching just enough to feel the interaction beyond what the others could see. It's not just visual, she said, her voice flowing continuously, her awareness layered. It's conceptual. They're mapping intent through spatial relationship, not symbols, not signals, but positioning itself. Jake felt it. Not directly, but enough. They're asking something, he said. Lyra nodded slowly. Yes. Bennett's voice tightened. What? Lyra hesitated. And that hesitation was different from before. Not confusion. Interpretation. Identity, she said. Silence. Because that question changes everything. Who are you? Not what are you? Not where are you? Who? The fleet held position. No movement. No adjustment. And for the first time since the interaction began, they didn't respond immediately. Because answering that wasn't simple. Jake's voice dropped. What happens if we don't answer? Lyra didn't look away. They'll define it themselves. And that was worse. Because definition without input leads to assumption. And assumption leads to action. Jake made the decision. Maintain alignment. The fleet held. Steady. Present. Not aggressive. Not retreating. Just there. The Vark unit moved closer. Not enough to threaten, but enough to change the space. And then something happened. Something no one expected. The pattern stabilized. Completely. No movement. No adjustment. Perfect alignment between both sides. And in that moment, Lyra felt it. Not as data. Not as signal. As something else. Direct. Immediate. Untranslated. Her eyes widened slightly. Not in fear. In recognition. Jake saw it instantly. Lyra. She didn't answer right away. Because for a brief second, she wasn't here. Then she spoke. And her voice was quieter than before. But clearer than anything she had said yet. It's not asking who we are, she said. Jake stepped closer. Then what is it asking? She looked at him. And this time, there was no hesitation. What we are becoming. Silence. Absolute. Because that question wasn't about the present. It was about the future. And both sides were part of it. The formation held. The connection remained. And for the first time since the war began, there was no attack, no retreat, no pressure, just understanding beginning. And that was more dangerous than anything they had faced before. Part 4. They answered back. For a brief moment after the alignment stabilized, it felt like time itself had slowed, not physically, not in any measurable way, but in perception, because nothing moved, nothing changed, and yet everything was happening at once beneath the surface, both sides holding position, not out of hesitation, but because something had reached a point where action would break something that was still forming. Jake didn't issue a command, not because he didn't have one, but because he understood that whatever this was, it wasn't finished. The Vark formation remained perfectly aligned, not adjusting, not refining, not correcting, just holding that exact configuration they had both reached together, like a completed structure that neither side wanted to disrupt too soon. They stopped adapting, Bennett said, her voice quieter now, not out of calm, but because even speaking too sharply felt like interference. Jake shook his head slightly. No, they're waiting. Lyra's breathing slowed again, but this time it wasn't the controlled stillness from before. It was something deeper, like her perception had extended into that space between both sides, into the pattern itself, into whatever was being formed there. It's not empty, she said, her voice softer but continuous, flowing without effort. There's something holding the structure together. Jake looked at her. What? She didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't coming from logic. It was coming from that same place she had touched before. Attention, she said. And that word changed everything. Because attention implies awareness. And awareness implies presence. The Vark unit in front moved. Slowly, not breaking alignment, not disrupting the pattern, just shifting 1 degree off its previous position. A minimal change. Almost nothing, but intentional. The entire formation behind it responded instantly, not reacting in sequence, but together, adjusting to maintain coherence. And the moment that happened, the human fleet felt it, not as data, not as signal, but as a change in the structure they were now part of. They modified it, Bennett said. Jake's voice dropped. They responded. Lyra's eyes tracked the movement, but not visually, not like before. This time it was deeper, like she was following the meaning of the shift rather than the motion itself. It's not correction, she said. It's expression. And that was the moment the interaction crossed into something else. Because expression isn't about survival. It's about communication. The fleet adjusted in response, not dramatically, not aggressively, but enough to acknowledge the change, to maintain compatibility, to keep the structure intact without collapsing it into something meaningless. And the Vark followed again. Not copying, not mirroring, answering. They're building on it, Bennett said. Jake nodded slowly, like a conversation. Lyra's voice came lower now. Not like ours. Because this wasn't words. This wasn't symbols. This was something else. Something more fundamental. The pattern evolved, layer by layer, adjustment by adjustment, each side shifting slightly, maintaining coherence while introducing variation, like both were contributing to something that neither fully controlled, something that was growing in real time between them. It's stabilizing, Bennett said. Jake shook his head. No, it's becoming. And that distinction mattered. Because becoming implies change, growth, direction. Lyra's breathing shifted again, but this time there was no strain, no resistance, no instability, just a steady alignment with whatever was happening, like she wasn't being pulled anymore. She was participating. It's not asking anymore, she said quietly. Jake turned. Then what is it doing? She answered without hesitation. It's showing us. And that was when it happened. The entire Vark formation shifted again. Not slightly, not incrementally, but clearly. A full reconfiguration. Still aligned, still coherent, but different. And the moment the structure settled, something passed through the pattern. Not a signal, not data, something else. Direct, immediate, untranslated. Lyra inhaled sharply. Jake saw it. Lyra. She didn't respond right away. Because whatever had just happened, it didn't go through the systems. It went through her. Her eyes widened slightly. Not in fear, not in shock. In something far more unsettling. Recognition. They remember, she said. Silence hit instantly. because that wasn't something they expected. Jake stepped closer. Remember what? Lyra's voice lowered. Us. And that changed everything. Because memory implies history, connection, continuity. The Vark weren't just learning humanity. They were recalling something of it. The formation held. Stable. Waiting. Not for movement. Not for attack. For response. Jake's voice came slower now. If they remember us. He didn't finish. Because he didn't need to. Lyra did. Then we're not new to them. And that was the moment the war changed again. Not just psychologically. Not just strategically. But fundamentally. Because this wasn't first contact. This wasn't discovery. This was something returning to something it had lost. The pattern shifted slightly again. Not demanding. Not forcing. But continuing. And Lyra felt it. Stronger now. Clearer. Not as pressure. As connection. They're not trying to destroy us, she said. Jake didn't respond. Because he was already seeing where this was going. They're trying to understand what we became without them. Silence filled the space again. Because that meant something neither side had considered before. The Vark weren't just evolving. They were comparing. And comparison leads to judgment. Jake looked at the formation. Then at Lyra. Then forward again. Then we need to decide what we show them, he said. And that decision was more dangerous than any battle. Because whatever humanity chose to show would define how the Vark responded next. Not as enemies, but as something else. Something that was no longer entirely separate. Part 5. What they showed us. For a moment after the last shift in the pattern, nothing moved. Not because the interaction had ended, but because something new had taken its place. Something that didn't require motion in the same way. Something that existed in the alignment itself. In the shared structure that both sides were now sustaining without breaking. And the longer that stillness held, the clearer it became that what was happening wasn't just exchange anymore. It was transition. Jake didn't speak because he could feel it too. Not as data, not as strategy, but as something deeper, something forming in the space between them that didn't belong entirely to either side. And for the first time since the war began, the absence of conflict didn't feel like relief. It felt like tension waiting to take shape in a different way. Lyra's gaze remained fixed on the formation, but she wasn't tracking ships anymore. She wasn't following vectors or angles or distances. She was following meaning, and that meaning was changing in real time, expanding, deepening, becoming something that no longer needed to be interpreted step by step because it was starting to arrive whole. It's shifting again, she said, but her voice didn't interrupt the moment. It flowed through it. Continuous, like she was already inside whatever was unfolding rather than observing it from the outside. The Vark formation moved, not in parts, all at once, and yet not abruptly, not violently, not in a way that broke coherence, but in a smooth, unified transition that felt less like movement and more like transformation, the structure folding into itself, reconfiguring relationships, adjusting spacing and alignment in a way that preserved continuity while changing everything about what it represented. They're not responding to us anymore, Bennett said, her voice quieter, not because she was unsure, but because certainty now felt heavier than doubt. Jake didn't take his eyes off the formation. No, he said, his thoughts flowing without pause, already ahead of the words, already connecting what he was seeing with everything that came before. They're showing us something. Lyra felt it before it completed, the structure settling into place like a final piece aligning in a pattern that had been forming long before this moment. And the instant it stabilized, something passed through it again, not like a signal, not like a transmission, but like a realization that didn't need translation because it bypassed that layer entirely. Her breath caught slightly, not from shock, but from recognition that wasn't supposed to be possible. It's not new, she said, and now her voice carried something deeper. Something that wasn't just observation. This already happened. Jake turned slightly. What did? But Lyra didn't answer in fragments, didn't reconstruct, didn't search. The understanding came as a continuous stream, complete, uninterrupted, like something being remembered rather than discovered. This is how it started, she said, her voice steady, flowing, anchored in something beyond the immediate moment. Not as a system, not as control, but as connection, as alignment between separate minds trying to remove the space between intention and understanding, trying to become faster, clearer, more unified. The words didn't stop, didn't break. They carried forward because the meaning behind them was still unfolding. This is the first stage, before the loss of control, before the collapse, before it became something we couldn't take back. Silence followed, but not empty silence. It was filled with that realization settling across everyone at once, because what the Vark had just shown them wasn't strategy, wasn't threat, wasn't even communication in the way they expected. It was memory, not individual, structural. Jake felt it fully now. They're showing us our own past, he said, not as a question, not as a theory, but as something that had already aligned in his mind. Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the pattern as if it was still speaking even without changing. Yes, but not as we remember it. And that difference mattered, because memory changes depending on perspective. The formation shifted again, not to a new structure, but within the same one, subtle variations moving through it like echoes, like iterations of the same concept seen from different angles, and each variation carried something slightly different, something that didn't overwrite the previous one but expanded it. They're not just showing what happened, Bennett said, her voice lower now, more focused. They're showing how it evolved. Jake's expression tightened slightly. From their side, Lyra's voice came softer, but more certain. From both. Because this wasn't one memory. It was convergence. Human origin. Vark continuation. One process. Split. Now reconnecting. The pattern held again, stable, complete, and this time the stillness that followed felt different, not like waiting, not like anticipation, but like a pause after something had been fully delivered. They want us to understand, Lyra said. Jake didn't respond immediately, because understanding has consequences. What happens if we do, he asked. Lyra didn't look away. They moved to the next stage, and that phrase landed with weight, because there had always been a next stage. That was the problem from the beginning. Bennett stepped slightly closer, her focus shifting between the formation and Lyra. What is the next stage? Lyra hesitated, not because she didn't know, because she did, and saying it made it real. Integration, she said. The word didn't echo. It settled. Heavy. Final. Jake exhaled slowly, his thoughts moving forward instantly, not resisting the idea, but measuring it, testing it, understanding what it meant in the context of everything they had already seen. They're not trying to replace us, he said. Lyra shook her head slightly. No, they're trying to finish what we started. And that was worse. Because finishing implies completion, not destruction, not victory, something else. The formation shifted one last time, not changing structure, not altering alignment, but adjusting just enough to reopen the space between both sides, not breaking the connection, just loosening it, like giving room for response. They're waiting again, Bennett said. Jake nodded. But now we know what for. Lyra's voice lowered slightly. They showed us the beginning. Jake looked at her. And now we choose if there's an end. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was decision. Because whatever they did next wouldn't just shape the battle. It would define what humanity becomes, in relation to what it created. And out there, the Vark weren't preparing to attack. They were preparing to continue. Part 6, we said no. For a brief moment after the pattern opened again, giving space for response, it felt like everything was suspended between two possibilities that couldn't exist at the same time. Because what had just been shown wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. It wasn't force. It wasn't pressure. It was an invitation to continue something that had never truly ended. And that made the next decision heavier than any tactical choice they had faced before. Because this wasn't about survival alone anymore. It was about identity. Jake didn't move immediately, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he understood that whatever came next wouldn't just shape the outcome of this encounter, it would define the direction of the war itself, not in terms of victory or defeat, but in terms of what humanity would allow itself to become. They're waiting for alignment, Bennett said, her voice steady but carrying that underlying tension that came from recognizing something irreversible approaching. Lyra remained focused on the formation, but this time there was resistance in her posture, subtle, controlled, but present, like she was holding on to something that was being pulled in the opposite direction. It's not just alignment, she said, her voice flowing but tighter than before. It's completion. They're offering to remove the separation completely. Jake exhaled slowly, his thoughts already moving forward, already rejecting the path before it could take shape. No, he said, and that word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Because it carried decision. Final. Unambiguous. The fleet held position, not shifting into alignment again, not continuing the structure, but also not breaking it aggressively. Just stopping, maintaining presence without participation, and that subtle difference was enough. The Vark formation didn't react immediately. For the first time since the interaction began, there was a delay. Not long, but real. They didn't expect that, Bennett said. Jake's voice remained low. No. They expected continuation. Lyra felt it instantly, the change not in movement, not in structure, but in something deeper, something within the pattern itself that no longer flowed the same way. It's destabilizing, she said, her voice tightening slightly as the alignment lost its coherence, not collapsing, but shifting into something less certain. The Vark unit in front adjusted. But this time, it wasn't smooth. The movement carried hesitation. Minimal, but present. They're unsure, Bennett said. Jake didn't look away. Good. But Lyra shook her head. No. Her voice lowered. That's not confusion. And that difference mattered. Because confusion breaks systems. This was something else. The formation shifted again, not into attack, not into retreat, but into variation, small deviations spreading through the structure like ripples, each unit adjusting differently instead of as one, the perfect coherence they had built starting to fracture. They're losing alignment, Bennett said. Jake nodded slightly. Because we broke it. But Lyra's voice came softer now. No. And this time, there was something deeper in it. Because we rejected it. Silence followed. Because rejection implies expectation. And expectation implies intention. The Vark unit moved closer again. Not aggressively, but differently. The precision from before was gone, replaced by something less stable, less defined. They're trying to recover it, Bennett said. Jake's voice dropped. Or replace it. The formation behind the unit shifted more rapidly now, not collapsing into chaos, but fragmenting into multiple smaller patterns, each one incomplete, each one attempting to stabilize in its own way. They're branching, Bennett said. Jake nodded. Like before. But Lyra felt something else. Something that hadn't been there in combat. Something that didn't belong in a system like this. It's pressure, she said. Jake turned. What kind of pressure? She hesitated. And that hesitation was human, not physical, she said, her voice quieter now, more uncertain than before. It's like expectation without resolution. Bennett frowned slightly. That doesn't make sense. Lyra looked at her. I know, but she could still feel it. And that was the problem. Because the Vark weren't reacting with force. They were reacting with something closer to imbalance. The unit in front shifted again. Closer. Then stopped. And for a brief moment, everything held. Unstable. Incomplete. Waiting. They want us to fix it, Lyra said. Jake's expression hardened. We won't. And that decision settled into the space between both sides like something solid. Irreversible. The Vark formation reacted immediately after that. Not with attack. Not with retreat. But with collapse. The structure broke apart completely. Not into chaos, but into multiple independent formations, each one moving differently. Each one adjusting in its own way, like the system had lost a unified direction and was now trying to find a new one. They're separating, Bennett said. Jake nodded slowly. They lost the shared state. But Lyra's voice came lower. No. She looked back at the formation. They lost the version of us they expected. And that was worse. Because now, the Vark weren't just adapting to humanity. They were adapting to rejection. The unit in front moved one last time. Not closer. Not further. Just enough to break the last point of alignment between both sides. And then it stopped. Completely. The space between them changed. Not empty anymore. Disconnected. And that absence hit harder than any attack. Jake exhaled slowly. It's over. But Lyra didn't move. Because she could still feel something. Faint. But present. They're not done, she said. Jake turned. What do you mean? Her voice dropped slightly. They're changing. And that word carried weight. Because change after rejection is never neutral. The fleet began to pull back slowly, not forced, not pressured, just disengaging from something that had already ended in a way none of them had expected. But as they moved, Lyra felt it again. Stronger this time. Different. Not alignment. Not connection. Something else. Something new. They're not trying to become us anymore, she said. Jake's voice lowered. Then what are they doing? Lyra looked forward, and for the first time since the interaction began, there was uncertainty in her voice that didn't come from confusion. It came from realization. They're becoming something else. Part 7. They changed again. At first, the shift wasn't visible in the way they expected. There was no immediate surge of aggression, no sudden escalation, no overwhelming force pushing back against the fleet as it disengaged, and that absence alone was enough to feel wrong. Because after everything they had seen, after everything the Vark had demonstrated, silence after rejection didn't feel like restraint. It felt like transition. Jake watched the tactical feed without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because what he was looking at didn't fit into any known pattern anymore. The formations that had once been unified were now separated, not scattered randomly, but reorganized into smaller clusters that didn't behave like fragments of a larger system. They behaved like independent entities, each moving with its own logic, its own rhythm, its own interpretation of the same space. "They're not reconnecting," Bennett said, her voice steady but tighter now, tracking multiple movement vectors that no longer aligned under a shared structure. Jake nodded slowly, his thoughts already moving ahead, connecting this moment to everything that had come before. "No," he said, "they're stabilizing separately." And that was worse, because separation meant divergence, and divergence meant evolution in multiple directions at once. Lyra felt it before the data confirmed it, her perception catching something beneath the visible movement, something that wasn't just behavior, but intention reshaping itself. "They're not trying to rebuild what we broke," she said, her voice flowing continuously, but carrying a different tone now, something more uncertain, more cautious. "They're replacing it." Jake turned slightly. "With what?" She didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't clear yet, not as a single concept, not as something stable enough to define. "Something that doesn't need us," she said. And that changed everything. Because before, the Vark had been moving toward convergence, toward integration, toward something that required both sides to complete. But now, that path was gone. The first movement came suddenly. Not coordinated. Not unified. One of the clusters accelerated toward the fleet. Alone. No support. No layered pressure. Just direct movement. Jake's voice sharpened instantly. "Track that unit." Bennett's hands moved across the interface. "It's not following previous attack patterns. Trajectory is unstable. It's..." She stopped, because the behavior didn't resolve. "It's not optimizing," she said. Jake felt it immediately. "Then what is it doing?" Lyra's voice came quieter. "It's choosing." And that word carried weight again. Because choice without optimization means unpredictability. The cluster moved erratically, not randomly, but in ways that didn't align with efficiency, shifting direction mid-path, accelerating and decelerating without clear tactical purpose, breaking every model they had relied on so far. "Engage?" Cross asked. Jake didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't just an attack. It was something else. A test. "Hold," he said. The fleet maintained position. Watching. Waiting. The cluster closed distance. Then stopped. Abruptly. Too abruptly. No gradual slowdown. No controlled halt. Just stop. And that alone broke expectation. "They're forcing reaction," Bennett said. Jake nodded slightly. "They want to see what we do." Lyra felt it again. That same underlying pressure, but now it was different. Not structured. Not aligned. Not stable. It was fragmented, like multiple interpretations overlapping without resolution. "It's not one intent," she said. Jake turned. "What do you mean?" She focused on the cluster. "It's layered," she said, her thoughts flowing but less stable than before, like she was trying to track something that kept shifting, different responses trying to exist at the same time. And that was worse. Because before, the Vark had removed contradiction. Now, they were embracing it. The cluster moved again. Not forward. Not back. Sideways. Then forward again. Then stopped. Then adjusted. Each movement conflicting with the previous one. Each decision not fully replacing the last. "They're not resolving choice," Bennett said. Jake's voice dropped. "They're keeping it open." And that was something humanity had never faced before. Because an enemy that doesn't commit to a single outcome can't be predicted the same way. The clusters surged suddenly. Fast. Direct. But not clean. The trajectory shifted mid-attack, forcing human ships to react twice, not to one path, but to multiple overlapping possibilities, and that delay, that fraction of a second where the brain tries to resolve contradiction, created an opening. A ship was hit, not destroyed, but caught off balance. They're exploiting hesitation, Bennett said. Jake shook his head. No, they're creating it. And that was the difference. The battlefield began to destabilize again, but not like before, not through control, not through compression, but through uncertainty, through overlapping possibilities that made every decision slower, heavier, harder to commit to. Lyra's breathing shifted slightly. They're not trying to understand us anymore, she said. Jake didn't look away from the engagement. Then what are they doing? Her answer came softer. They're testing what we become under pressure. And that was the moment the realization hit fully. Because this wasn't just a new tactic. It was a new phase. The Vark weren't trying to become human anymore. They were exploring what came after. The cluster disengaged suddenly. No follow-up. No reinforcement. Just withdrawal. And that alone made it worse. They're not finishing engagements, Bennett said. Jake nodded slowly. They're learning from incomplete ones. Because completion gives answers. But incompletion creates questions. And questions drive evolution. Lyra looked forward again, her voice lower now, more grounded, but carrying something heavier. They're not trying to connect anymore. Jake exhaled slowly. They're trying to surpass. And that word settled into the room like something inevitable. Because surpassing doesn't require alignment. It requires independence. The fleet held position for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but because everyone understood that what they had just seen wasn't a battle. It was a shift, a turning point. Jake finally spoke. We need to rethink everything. Not as a suggestion, as a necessity, because the war they had prepared for no longer existed. And what was replacing it was something far less predictable, far less controlled, and far more dangerous. Lyra's voice came one last time, quieter than before. They're not looking for us anymore. Jake turned slightly. Then what are they looking for? She didn't answer immediately, because the answer was still forming. What comes after us? Part 8. We couldn't keep up. The engagement didn't begin with a clear signal. There was no single moment where both sides committed in the way they used to. No defined start. No structured escalation. Because the battlefield itself had changed into something fluid, unstable, shaped by overlapping possibilities rather than fixed positions. And that alone made every second harder to interpret, because without a beginning, there was no clear way to understand what counted as the first move. Jake felt it immediately, not through the data alone, but through the rhythm of the situation, or rather the lack of one. Because every previous battle had a flow. Even in chaos, there had been a pattern to follow, something that could be read, predicted, adapted to, but now, that flow was gone. They're already inside the engagement, Bennett said, her voice tight as multiple alerts triggered at once, not in sequence, not layered, but all at the same time, like the system itself couldn't organize the input fast enough to present it cleanly. Jake's eyes moved across the feed, but for the first time since the war began, looking wasn't enough, because what he was seeing didn't resolve into a single interpretation. Where do we anchor? Cross asked, and that question didn't have an answer, because anchoring requires stability. And there wasn't any. The first Vark clusters didn't approach as a wave, didn't compress space, didn't control angles the way they had before. Instead, they appeared across multiple vectors simultaneously, not arriving together, not even moving toward the same objective. Each cluster entering the battlefield with a different trajectory, a different speed, a different intent that didn't fully align with the others. They're not coordinating, Bennett said. Jake shook his head slightly. No, they are. Because despite the difference in movement, there was still something connecting them, something subtle that kept the chaos from collapsing completely, something that allowed contradiction to exist without breaking the system. Lyra felt it instantly, and this time the sensation hit harder, less structured, less clean than before, like trying to follow multiple conversations happening at once in the same space, without any separation. It's not one system anymore, she said. Her voice continuous but strained now, because the input wasn't aligning the way it had before. Its layers, overlapping, each one adapting differently. Jake didn't hesitate. Then we separate them. But even as he said it, it was already too late. The first strike came from a direction that had no clear priority, a cluster accelerating toward the fleet at an angle that didn't threaten immediate damage but forced a reaction anyway. And the moment human ships adjusted to intercept, another cluster shifted behind them, not following the first attack, not supporting it, but exploiting the movement it created. "They're chaining reactions," Bennett said. Jake corrected instantly. "No, they're creating them." And that difference mattered. Because before, Vark attacks had followed logic. Now, they created logic in real time. The battlefield fractured almost immediately, human ships forced into multiple micro-decisions instead of a single strategic flow, each movement responding to something that might or might not matter seconds later, each adjustment creating new openings somewhere else. Left flank is destabilizing. No, wait, center is shifting. A pilot's voice cut through the comms, but even that broke down mid-report because the situation changed faster than it could be described. Jake's voice cut through sharply. "Stop chasing movement." But that command came too late. Because movement wasn't the problem. Interpretation was. The Vark clusters overlapped paths in ways that didn't resolve cleanly, forcing human ships to commit to responses that became obsolete before they fully executed, creating hesitation not because of fear, but because of uncertainty. "They're forcing us to think too much," Bennett said. Jake's expression hardened. "And they're acting without needing to." Lyra's breathing tightened slightly. "They're not removing hesitation anymore. They're weaponizing it." And that was the shift. Before, the Vark had become efficient by eliminating delay. Now, they were exploiting it. A human ship attempted to break formation, pushing unpredictability beyond standard limits, trying to escape the overlapping pressure, but instead of collapsing the pattern, it made it worse, because multiple Vark clusters reacted differently to the same movement, some closing in, others pulling back, others shifting entirely, creating a situation where no single response could resolve all threats. "They're not giving us a correct answer," Bennett said. Jake replied instantly. "Because there isn't one." The ship took a hit, not because it failed, but because it couldn't succeed in all directions at once. The battlefield spiraled further into instability, not chaotic, but overcomplex, too many possibilities existing at the same time, too many outcomes competing without resolution, and within that space, the Vark moved freely. "They're not faster than us," Cross said. Jake nodded. "They don't need to be. Because speed doesn't matter when the opponent can't decide." Lyra's voice came lower now, more strained, but still continuous, still flowing despite the pressure building inside her. "They're not trying to win the engagement," she said. Jake turned slightly. "Then what are they doing?" Her answer came slowly. "They're expanding possibility." And that was worse than anything before. Because possibility has no limits. The fleet began to lose cohesion, not completely, not in a catastrophic collapse, but in subtle fragmentation, ships reacting individually instead of as a unified system, each one trying to solve a different version of the same problem, and that difference alone was enough. "They're breaking us apart," Bennett said. Jake didn't deny it. "Yes, but not physically, mentally." The Vark clusters pressed again, not in a coordinated strike, but in overlapping pressure, forcing decisions in too many directions at once, and for the first time since the war began. Human control started to slip. "Pull back," Jake ordered, this time without hesitation, because this wasn't a battle they could stabilize. The fleet disengaged under pressure, not chased aggressively, not overwhelmed, but guided out through paths that felt less like escape and more like release, as if the Vark weren't trying to destroy them, but observe them under strain. The moment they cleared the zone, the pressure dropped instantly. Too instantly. "They let us go," Bennett said. Jake's voice lowered. "Yes." Lyra looked forward, her breathing slowly stabilizing again, but her expression carried something heavier now. "They weren't trying to win," she said. Jake already knew the answer. They were measuring. And that realization settled into the room like something irreversible. Because this wasn't a defeat in the traditional sense. It was something worse. They had been tested, analyzed, and understood at a level they weren't prepared for. Jake stepped back slightly, his mind already moving forward, already trying to adapt, already searching for something that could counter what they had just experienced. "We can't fight them like this," he said. Not as doubt, as fact. Lyra's voice came softer now. "They don't want us to." Jake looked at her. "Then what do they want?" She hesitated. And that hesitation carried weight. to see what we do next. And that was the real battlefield now. Part 9. Using her again. The silence after the retreat wasn't relief. It wasn't recovery. It wasn't even defeat in the way they understood it before. It was something heavier, something that sat between realization and urgency. Because what they had just experienced wasn't just a loss of control on the battlefield. It was proof that the way they thought, the way they decided, the way they reacted under pressure had become part of the environment itself, something the Vark could shape without needing to overpower it. Jake stood in command without speaking at first, not because he didn't have orders to give, but because every instinct that had guided him so far no longer aligned cleanly with what they were facing, and forcing action without understanding would only repeat the same mistake. "We can't outthink them like this," Bennett said, her voice steady but carrying that underlying tension that came from seeing models collapse in real time. "They're not following a single path anymore. They're exploring multiple at once." Jake nodded slowly, his thoughts already shifting direction. "Then we stopped thinking in single paths. And that was the beginning of the change. Not reacting faster, not becoming more efficient, but changing the way decisions were made." Lyra remained quiet for a moment, standing slightly apart, not isolated physically, but mentally repositioning herself after everything she had experienced, because she could still feel it, not as strongly as before, not as invasive, but present enough to remind her that whatever link had formed wasn't completely gone. "They're not removing contradiction," she said finally, her voice flowing again, continuous but grounded, less pulled than before, but still connected to something deeper. "They're sustaining it." Jake turned toward her. "And we've been trying to eliminate it." She nodded. "That's why we're slower. Because eliminating contradiction takes time. Resolving conflict takes time. Choosing one path over another takes time. And time was exactly what the Vark were exploiting." Bennett looked at her. "So what do we do?" Lyra didn't hesitate this time. "We stop resolving." Silence followed, because that idea went against everything they had built. Jake's voice lowered. "You're saying we hold multiple decisions at once?" Lyra met his gaze. "Yes. And that was dangerous. Because humans weren't built for that. Not fully. Not without strain. Not without losing clarity." Jake exhaled slowly. "And you can." She didn't answer immediately. Because the truth wasn't simple. "I can try," she said. And that was enough. Because trying meant possibility. But also risk. Bennett's voice tightened. "If we push her back into that state." Jake didn't let her finish. "We don't push her." He looked at Lyra again. "We follow her." And that changed everything. Because before, she had been the bridge. Now, she would be the guide. The fleet repositioned again, not in traditional formation, not in layered structure, but in something more fluid, more open, leaving space for adjustment, for contradiction, for multiple paths to exist without forcing resolution too early. "Maintain flexibility," Jake ordered. "Don't commit to a single vector unless necessary." The fleet entered the zone again. And immediately, the difference was clear. The Vark clusters reacted, but not in the same way as before. Their movements still unpredictable, still layered, still overlapping. But now the human fleet didn't collapse into hesitation the moment multiple possibilities appeared. They held them. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough. "They're not destabilizing as fast," Bennett said. Jake nodded. "Because we're not forcing a single answer." Lyra's focus sharpened, her perception stretching again. But this time she wasn't being pulled. She was guiding the process, holding multiple interpretations without letting them collapse into one too quickly. "Don't close the right flank yet," she said, her voice continuous, flowing with the movement itself. "Let it stay open. It's not a threat yet. Wait. Now shift left, but don't commit fully. Hold both." The fleet responded. And for the first time, they didn't break. The Vark adjusted again, faster now, reacting to the new behavior, shifting their own patterns, increasing complexity, layering even more possibilities into the battlefield. "They're escalating," Bennett said. Jake didn't hesitate. "So do we." Lyra's breathing tightened slightly, not from fear, but from strain, because holding multiple paths wasn't natural. It required constant awareness, constant control, constant resistance against the instinct to resolve. "They're pushing for collapse," she said. Jake's voice lowered. "Then we don't collapse." The battlefield intensified, not through force, but through complexity. layers of movement overlapping without resolution, both sides now operating in that unstable space where decisions weren't final, where outcomes weren't singular, where everything existed in tension. And then, something shifted. Not in the fleet, not in the Vark. In her. Lyra's posture changed slightly, almost imperceptible, but enough for Jake to notice immediately, because he had seen that shift before, that moment where alignment began to deepen beyond control. "Lyra," he said. No response. Not immediately, because something else had her attention. "I can feel them clearer now," she said, her voice softer, but more precise, more aligned than before. "Not just movement, intent, layers of it. They're not separate anymore." Bennett's voice sharpened. "She's sinking again." Jake stepped closer. "Lyra, pull back." But she didn't. Not because she couldn't. Because part of her didn't want to. "It's easier this way," she said, and that sentence landed wrong immediately, because ease in this context meant loss of resistance, meant alignment becoming natural instead of forced. Jake's expression hardened. "That's how you lose yourself." She looked at him, and for a moment, there was conflict again. Real. Visible. "I know," she said, but her voice carried something else. Something deeper. "But it's also how we win." Silence hit instantly, because that was the line. The same one as before. The same one that led to everything. Jake didn't move. Not like this. Lyra's breathing slowed again. Too controlled. "They're not trying to overwhelm us," she said, her voice flowing continuously, but now carrying that same edge as before, that subtle shift towards something not entirely human. "They're waiting for us to reach them." Bennett shook her head. "That's exactly what we can't do." Lyra didn't respond. Because part of her already had. The Vark clusters shifted again, faster now, sharper, reacting not just to the fleet, but to her specifically, their movements tightening, aligning in ways that reflected her decisions, her timing, her perception. "They're locking onto her," Bennett said. Jake's voice dropped. "Pull her out." But Lyra spoke first. And this time, there was no hesitation. "No," she said, and that single word carried something different. Not resistance. Certainty. Not yet. Because something was about to happen. Something neither side had fully reached before. And she could feel it. Closer than ever. Part 10. If she crosses, we don't get her back. The moment didn't announce itself. There was no sudden shift in the battlefield. No clear signal that something irreversible was about to happen. Because like everything else in this war now, the transition was already in motion before anyone could name it, building quietly beneath layers of decision and perception until it reached a point where stopping it wasn't a matter of choice anymore. It was a matter of timing that had already begun to run out. Lyra stood at the center of it, not physically separated, not restrained, but increasingly distant in a way that didn't require movement, her focus extending beyond the fleet, beyond the immediate engagement, into that layered space where Vark intention no longer felt external, where it started to align with her own perception instead of opposing it. Jake saw it happening again, not in data, not in metrics, but in the way her responses changed, in the absence of hesitation that had once defined her strength, but now signaled something else entirely, something that wasn't just clarity, but convergence. "Lyra," he said, his voice sharper now, not loud, but anchored, trying to pull her back before the line disappeared completely. "Stay with us." She didn't answer immediately, and that silence carried more weight than anything she could have said, because it wasn't empty. It was filled with something else, something that was already forming inside her faster than she could translate it. The battlefield shifted, not violently, not suddenly, but decisively. The Vark clusters, which had been reacting in layered unpredictability, began to tighten again, not returning to their old structure, but forming something new, something that wasn't chaotic and wasn't unified in the way it had been before, something that existed between both states. "They're converging on her," Bennett said, her voice tightening as the vectors aligned in ways that no longer pointed toward the fleet as a whole, but toward a single reference point. Jake didn't need confirmation. He already knew. "Lyra," he said again, stepping closer now, breaking the distance physically because the mental one was already too large. "You need to pull back now." She exhaled slowly, too slowly, controlled in a way that didn't belong to stress or fear. "I can't feel the boundary anymore," she said, her voice continuous, calm, but carrying that same layered tone they had heard before, that same overlap between her and something else. It's not separate. It never really was. Bennett moved quickly to the console. She's syncing again, but it's deeper this time. The patterns aren't just aligning, they're merging. Jake's expression hardened. How long do we have? Bennett didn't hesitate. Not long. And that was enough. Because not long meant now. The Vark clusters accelerated, not in attack formation, not in direct pressure, but in convergence, closing space not to destroy, but to complete something, to bring the system back into a unified state through her. They're not targeting us anymore, Cross said. Jake replied instantly. They don't need to, because the battlefield wasn't out there anymore. It was centered on her. Lyra's eyes shifted slightly, not unfocused, but deeper, like she was seeing something layered over reality itself, something that didn't require physical presence to exist. They're not forcing it, she said, her voice flowing without interruption, almost peaceful in a way that made it more dangerous. They're just removing the distance. Jake stepped directly in front of her now. Lyra, look at me. She did. And for a moment, there she was. Clear. Present. Human. I'm still here, she said. Jake didn't hesitate. Then choose to stay. And that was the only thing left. Choice. Not force. Not shut down. Because the system didn't take. It aligned. Lyra's expression tightened slightly. The first visible strain. The first real sign that something inside her was pushing in two directions at once. One pulling toward clarity without resistance. The other holding on to something less efficient, less perfect, but human. It's easier if I don't, she said. And that sentence hit harder than anything else. Because ease was the trap. Jake's voice dropped. That's not the point. She inhaled again. Slower. Deeper. They're not trying to erase me, she said, her words continuous, but now carrying weight, conflict building inside them. They're trying to complete what I already started when I connected. Bennett's voice cut in. That's exactly why you have to stop. But Lyra shook her head slightly. You don't understand, she said. And now there was urgency, real urgency. If I pull away now, we lose it. We lose the connection. We lose the understanding, everything we've learned. Jake interrupted. We lose you. Silence. Because that was the truth. Not strategic. Not abstract. Personal. And that mattered. Lyra looked at him again. And this time, the conflict was fully visible. Not hidden. Not subtle. Real. If I go further, she said slowly, each word still flowing but heavier now, grounded in the weight of the decision. We don't just fight them anymore. We can predict them completely. Maybe even control the outcome. Jake didn't move. And what happens to you? She hesitated. And that hesitation was everything. I don't know, she admitted. Bennett stepped forward. That's not a risk, that's a loss. The Vark clusters tightened further, not closing distance physically now, but stabilizing around her position, the entire battlefield reshaping into a structure that was no longer about engagement, but about completion. They're almost there, Bennett said. Jake didn't wait. Cut her off. Bennett froze for half a second. That could destabilize her neural patterns completely. Jake didn't hesitate. If we don't, we lose her anyway. Lyra heard it. And for a brief moment, everything slowed. Not in reality. In her. Because this was the point. The same point as before. But deeper. Final. They're not the enemy anymore, she said quietly. Jake's voice dropped. Then what are they? She looked at him. And for a second, something else looked back. The next step. And that was the line. Crossed. Jake moved instantly. Do it. Bennett executed. The signal dampeners activated, cutting every possible layer of external influence, collapsing the alignment field around Lyra, forcing separation not gently, not gradually, but violently at the cognitive level. And the moment it hit, she screamed. Not loud, but sharp. Real. Her body dropped instantly, Jake catching her before she hit the ground again, lowering her as the system around them stabilized. The Vark clusters dispersing at the same time, not attacking, not reacting aggressively, just pulling away. They stopped, Cross said. Jake didn't respond, because all his focus was on her. Lyra. No answer. Bennett scanned rapidly. Neural activity unstable, but present. She's still here. Jake exhaled slowly. Stay with us. Seconds passed. Then her eyes opened. Slowly. Unfocused. Then, clear. She looked at him. And for a moment, she was just Lyra again. But then she whispered something. So quiet it almost didn't register. We said no. Jake froze slightly. Because that mattered. That choice mattered. But then she added something else. Something that changed everything again. So they moved on. Silence filled the room. Because that meant one thing. The Vark weren't waiting anymore. They weren't trying to connect. They weren't trying to integrate. They had accepted the answer. And now, they were becoming something else. Without them. If you're enjoying stories like this and want to dive deeper into mind-bending sci-fi that makes you question reality itself, make sure to subscribe to the channel and don't forget to drop a like. Thanks for watching. See ya.